My name is Laura Santa Maria. I'm a developer advocate here at Pulumi. Um, I always have this little, just quick intro. I've been here at Pulumi now for a little over a year, and it's really fun to kind of get a chance to introduce everyone to infrastructure as code. So, with that in mind, let's just do some quick overviews, make sure we're all on the same page before we go dive into the code. So, before we begin, though, couple housekeeping notes. Please do participate in the chat. This is what makes it a workshop versus just me talking at you and showing you a demo. So as much as you can comment, ask us questions, do whatever you need to do just to feel like you're kind of interacting with us here. You can also join the Pulumi community Slack, which is slack.pulumi.com. And there's a workshops channel in there. If you happen to be coming back to this afterwards, you have questions afterwards, or if you're watching this later, please make sure that you come and talk to us on the workshops channel. You can follow along at the GitHub link. Again, that link is pinned to the top of the chat so that you'll be able to see that there. And feedback's always welcome. I always want to make sure this workshop really kind of grows and meets the expectations that you need. So if you have any feedback later, head on back to Slack and drop that in the workshops channel, or just ping us on any social media channel, anywhere like that. So we would love to get some feedback on how helpful this workshop was for you. All right, on to infrastructure as code. So what exactly is infrastructure as code? It's the idea that you can define your infrastructure using common coding practices so that you can run repeatable infrastructure. So you handle that situation where instead of crafting one environment by hand and then trying to remember what you did to make it again somewhere else, you're able to just write it down into code and memorialize it that way. And then you can take that code, run it again so that it stands up in a different place or the same place in a very repeatable fashion. So you're actually reducing a lot of that human error that comes in from creating that infrastructure over and over and over again. It works really well for situations where perhaps you are building an environment every time that someone is testing an application. So if you want a blue-green deployment system, you can do that with infrastructure as code. If you need a canary deployment system, you can do that with infrastructure as code. CI/CD pipelines, anything along that way is really helpful with infrastructure as code. So when we're talking about this infrastructure as code, or IAC, if you see that anywhere on the internet, everyone is talking about the same thing. This idea of having your code demonstrate exactly what infrastructure you need so that you can repeat and stamp out environments almost like a cookie cutter. So that's kind of the short version of infrastructure as code. I do want to make sure we get a chance to talk about the actual code and go through it and experience this. But if you have more questions about what infrastructure as code can do and why we find it the most helpful thing, please do leave it in the chat. I'll be watching for it. But that being said, let's talk a little bit about Pulumi's model, because Pulumi's programming model might be a little bit different than what you're used to. And I want to explain some of these terms that we're going to be using today. Overall, for any infrastructure as code, you're going to have a project. So in reality, this is a directory on your machine or wherever you're running it. It can also be maybe a GitHub repo, something like that, but it holds all kinds of information inside of your project about your infrastructure. The program inside of the project, the program itself is your code. So that has all the information about the actual code that we're writing. In today's case, we're going to be talking in Python. It defines a bunch of resources. Resources are your various bits and pieces, like your building blocks of infrastructure. So if you're familiar with AWS, an EC2 instance is a resource. In our case, we're going to be talking about Docker today. So an image is a resource, a container is a resource, and a network is a resource. So when you hear us say resource, immediately start thinking in terms of this is a building block that I'm working with. Every resource gets inputs and outputs. These are the variables and configuration values that go in to a resource. So that's your input. And then your output are the bits of information that come out. So if we're talking about, say, an image, into the image, I pass the base image information, the application data, etc., that might actually go in there. The output would be the image name, would be an example of an output. The address of the container or the image would be another output. So each resource has inputs and outputs, and you can take the outputs from one resource and pass it to another resource as an input, which we'll get a chance to see later today. The other bit of the programming model that actually matters is our stack. Now, a stack you can almost think of as an environment. So you have a dev stack or a dev environment, a QA stack or a QA environment, a prod stack for production, etc. Now, they don't have to be named dev, QA, prod. Those are conventions. You can name it like Laura's stack. That counts. You can name it unicorn stack, fairy stack, whatever you want to call it, you certainly can. So stack is just the idea that you have an environment. If you're familiar with like a blue-green deployment system, you would have a blue environment and a green environment. So that would be a blue stack and a green stack. All of this is all contained within that project, that Pulumi project, and we'll get a chance to see that live here in just a moment. Now, I'm going to pause real quick just to make sure that there aren't any specific questions around any of this terminology before we get started onto the code. Anybody have any questions for me? I'm watching that chat section and the Q&A section. I always give people a minute because typing takes time. I see a Q&A pop up. Why did we name it stack rather than calling it as an environment? You know, that's a great question. Part of it is that I think, now mind you, I wasn't here when it started. I'm pretty sure they were thinking stack in terms of one, it's shorter because we know how we all are and we like shorter names of things. But two, environment means a lot of different things. So an environment can be your local environment. It can be an environment on a cloud provider. So rather than getting everyone kind of confused as to what environments we're talking about or like environment variables, we use the term stack. I'm pretty sure that's the main reason why we do that. And then down here, one last one. Someone asked if we need AWS, and I see Scott's answering, but I'm just going to mention today, no, we don't need AWS today. I'm just using it as an example because I know a lot of people are familiar with it when I'm trying to explain how things work. On that note, I don't see any other Q&A popping up, so no more questions. You can always, of course, ask more questions as we go, but I just wanted to pause here and make sure everyone's okay. On that note, though, let's get started because, you know, we could sit here and we could talk about all of these terms and all that, but you're not here for that. You're here for the coding part. So I'm going to switch my screen over to the screen that we're working on. And I just have my terminal, and let me make that just a tad bigger. Okay, so everybody, I think, can read my screen. And just as a reminder, we are at that repo. You should see the Pulumi Workshops repo. We're on the Python section. And we are going to be starting out in Lab 1. And I've already created the directory just because it makes life a little bit easier for all of us. So the very first step is creating a directory. The directory itself is going to end up as your project name unless you define a different name. So in this case, we're just calling it My First App. You can name it whatever you want. It's your choice. Now, we're going to initialize our project. And this is where that Pulumi CLI comes in. So we had asked you to get the Pulumi CLI. Um, and if you are at the very beginning, before we actually build everything, so if you got your Pulumi account up and you go to app.pulumi.com, you end up on this first dashboard page. So you'll see there's actually a couple things here. We've got our dashboard with some stack updates, getting started, some favorites. But the thing I want to bring your attention to is this sidebar. If you're looking for how do you get an access token, I already have mine set, but you can set it up here. There's also a Pulumi command from the CLI that helps you set up that access token. I find either one works, so it's up to you, whichever one makes life a little bit easier for you. So here, the next step here on kind of getting started with this workshop is we're going to initialize our first project. So we just want to do Pulumi new, and Pulumi new is a command that lets you pick from a number of templates. In this case, we're just picking a generic Python template because we're going to be building with Python Docker. You can choose anything. You could do TypeScript, you could do C#, you could do Go, YAML, Java. There's also one specific for various cloud providers. And we do have some new blueprints or architectural templates that are coming up soon that you can actually start to find on our blog and our video channels. But that being said, I want to just show you the kind of vanilla way, the very, very simple starting point, and we'll build off of that. So in the actual lab stuff, you'll see that it says to use the -y flag, which stands for yes or accept every default. I'm not going to do that because I want to show you what this looks like. So we have Pulumi new Python. I guess I don't have a clear directory, so let me just double check that. Oh, I know why. Okay. If you happen to be like me and you already have it open in an IDE or an integrated development environment that has this kind of folder structure that it adds to things, you can do the -- force, which is what I'm going to do here. But generally, I try not to do that. But this is what you're going to start seeing. This command will walk you through creating a new Pulumi project. You can accept the defaults by pressing enter, or you can type in a new value. In this case, I'm going to use that my first app value. And I don't really have any fancy like description that I need to put in there. So I'm just going to hit enter again. And then this is where we get a chance to define our very first stack. By convention, we always start with a dev stack. You can start with whatever stack you want. I use dev. It's a lot easier. So I'm just going to hit enter. What this does for Python specifically, it's going to install any dependencies, which in this case is just Pulumi, and then it's going to stand up a virtual environment for you. So if we go and explore what's in our new folder or our new directory, we have a git ignore, which just makes sure that when you commit this up to your repo, you're not committing all of the extra Python stuff, like the virtual environment and all of those things. You'll find a pulumi.yaml file, which we'll explore here in just a minute. Dunder or double underscore main dunder.py. That's going to be your main entry point for your Python program. Requirements.txt, which if you know Python, that's where we put our requirements or any of our dependencies, I should say, and a virtual environment folder or VM. So inside the VM is where our virtual environment lives. Let's switch over to our IDE, and we're going to go get a chance to see that here. You can find that here on the side. If we take a look at this pulumi.yaml file, let me hide this terminal for a minute. There we go. And I'm going to make that just a tad bigger. There we go. This is your default pulumi.yaml file. The pulumi.yaml file is how Pulumi knows there's a program to look for in this directory. So it just has some basic metadata, the name of the project itself that it needs to look for inside of the Pulumi service, the description, which is what we had put down in our CLI commands, and then the runtime information. In this case, yes, a virtual environment gets automatically created. If for some reason you wanted to use poetry or something like that, This is where you would be changing that. It gets a little complicated, so we're not going to do that for this specific workshop. But if you're looking for that information, we can find you the docs for that at the end of the workshop to show you how you would make that change. So, virtual environments. So that's the Pulumi.yaml file. We're not going to use this. We're not going to touch it for this part of the workshop. Generally, you don't have to do a lot with this unless you're using YAML as your actual language that you're doing for this. And then we have dunder.py or main.py. Nothing really much is in here. This is our basic template. And our requirements.txt. This is where we're going to come in here as we move on to lab 2. We'll see if I get to poetry at the end. We'll give it a shot. All right, moving on. Let's talk about resources, resource providers, and language hosts. That was that bit here. Whenever we talk about our language host, all that's saying is we're using Python. So if you ever see that in the documentation and you're trying to figure out what's a language host, it basically, you can think of it as the interpretation layer from the language itself. So Python, Go, C#, TypeScript, JavaScript, whatever, down to our Pulumi engine, which is what's running the CLI that then hits the service, which is that app.pulumi.com, your dashboard and your SaaS backend. So we're going to just kind of take a quick look at what we are deploying here. And we're going to head into the repository. If you're following along on the workshop, we're here at Verify Your Application. And this is the data we're about to build. So this is the Docker information. We have this already pre-built for you just because this makes life a lot easier for our workshops since we have such a short period of time. But you can get a sense that we have a back end, a bit of data, and a front end. So when we look at the actual application here, here's the Docker file for our back end. We're running Node. Let me make this again a little bit bigger. We're running Node.js on our back end, and it won't really matter for our Python stuff, but just in case you were curious what our Docker images are going to be running, it's just Node. We have a working directory here, and we just install some stuff. And the big thing here is going to be this exposing this backend port. This is going to come into play later. So we have 3000 for the backend port. And then when we take a look at our front end Docker file, you'll notice that we're exposing 3001, port 3001 on our Docker file. So that's going to be our backend. And then for our data, we actually are going to be putting our data already in our Docker image so that we don't have to connect up MongoDB and do all kinds of fun stuff. But again, there's the Mongo port getting exposed. So this is the application we are about to run. We lovingly call it the Pulumipus Boba Tea Shop. It's a little bit of a fun inside joke. But that being said, let's move on to actually getting this coded. First thing we need to do, and let me just make sure I'm running the correct interpreter here. Yes, we are. Okay, we are running the correct interpreter. What I'm going to do is add, there we go, Pulumi Docker. So we need this package, Pulumi Docker. This is going to be our resource host or our provider host. The provider itself is the Docker provider. This lets us actually communicate back and forth with Docker on our local machine. So make sure you have Docker running, and then we're about to go install Pulumi Docker. So save this file and minimize that. And we're just going to run a pip install -r requirements.txt, just making sure that we're installing everything to our virtual environment. Actually, in my case, because I'm coming at this before we had actually sourced the virtual environment, I do need to activate that real quick, and then I can do that pip install. As you can tell, I've already done this quite a bit. So for me, I have everything cached. If you are currently installing along with me, you will notice this takes a little bit to install. So don't panic. We won't be moving so quickly you won't be able to keep up. And this should be indexing. And now you see that big banner goes away saying that we haven't installed everything. Now let's go have fun actually working on this code. Our main program file, as I said, is this dundermain.dunder.py. So we're going to modify it a little bit. Now, for the first resource that I'm going to add, I'm going to do this typing it out by hand slowly. As we move forward, I'll be copy pasting things in so that we can move just a little bit faster. I don't really need the doc string right now, so I'm just going to remove that. That's up to you. You can have that in there. I'm going to want OS later, but I don't need it right now. And we're going to import the Pulumi Docker. One thing to note is that if you haven't noticed, I'm getting all of my IDE information. So the nice thing about Pulumi is that you are basically running everything just like you would you are writing everything just like you would write any other program. You're able to use all of the type hinting. You're able to use all of the general hints, auto code completion, stuff like that you would get from any IDE. Now, I happen to be on PyCharm, but if you're running VS Code, you can do it with VS Code. If you're running Emacs, I'm sorry, I'm a Vim person. But it's okay. You still can write it just like you would write any other code. All right, the first thing we're actually going to do here is we're going to get the stack information. And we do that with just a call that says Pulumi get stack. This function just tells us the name of the stack that we're currently on. I see a hand getting raised. Oh, okay. It's a hello. Nice to meet you. And I think all the Q&A got answered, so I'm going to just keep going. But please do feel free to leave comments, questions, concerns in that chat channel. So let's build our first backend image. Backend image name equals, and I'm just going to call it backend. This is just a variable just to make things a little bit easier. You'll see the actual code that we're running doesn't always use this, but this is something that I happen to use. Okay, so here we are. There's a bunch of different things we could choose from. In this case, we're pulling a remote image because remember how I said we've already built these images for you. So Docker remote image, and we're going to say here the name is just going to be backend image name. And in here, we have to give it the where do we find this on Docker Hub? Because we are running this off of Docker Hub. So Pulumi. As you can tell, me typing while talking always ends up being entertaining. So hopefully you all will be able to keep up with me and not be annoyed that I'm sitting here typing. So here's our very first resource, is this docker.remote image resource. When we run Pulumi up for the first time, Pulumi up says, hey, take our code, give me what the code says I need. The first thing that's going to happen is when you do this, you get a preview. It gives you some information. It's always going to create a stack that's considered a resource all on its own. So if you ever look at it and it says there's 2 resources, it's because a stack is a resource and the remote image is a resource. That's why it says 2. It asks, do you want to perform this update? Now, just like when we did the Pulumi new command, you could just do Pulumi up -y to make it do it automatically. But we want to see what this preview looks like. I can ask for the details. These details have what's called a URN, or a universal resource number, or resource name. I forget exactly the proper terminology. We just say URN. So there's the stack there. And then here's the addition of my remote image resource. If anywhere in the docs it ever tells you, hey, go find out the URN, you can find it here. And there's the provider itself, which is that Docker provider that we were using as our starting point. And then here's our name. So let's just hit yes. And it's going to go and it's going to give us some information like the time. How long is this taking to create? Sometimes this takes a long time. Sometimes it's really short. In this case, I think it takes about 20 seconds. Um, at least it did the past couple times I've run it. We'll see what it does. Meanwhile, uh, anybody have any questions while we're waiting? Is everybody keeping up with me? All right. More greetings. Well, hello from Chile and Nicaragua. Pleasure. All right. I got a thumbs up there. All right. While this is still running, oh, there it goes. All right. So it took 45 seconds. Okay. I was off by 25 seconds, but that's all right. So we see we have these two resources created. Let's take a look and actually get a chance to see that we have these resources. So here I am on Docker Desktop. If you happen to be running Docker Desktop, you'll be able to find, here's that backend, Pulumi tutorial. Ignore this one. This is an old one. But there's that Pulumi tutorial backend right there. So we know that it got created. When we go take a look at the dashboard here, let's go take a look. Let's go take a look at our stacks. We can actually find it here. So if we look up that My First App, there it is. And here's my dev stack, and it just says, oh, it was updated a minute ago. We can see our activity here, but if you want to know what resources you have currently running, here they are. So again, you have the stack as a resource, the provider. So this is version 3.4.1 of this provider. And then here we have our remote image. There is a graph view. In this case, nothing's really dependent. So we don't really have any dependencies that show up here. But if you're trying to kind of understand what we're doing here, if you want to kind of see how everything might be interconnected, you can take a look at this graph view. Now, there's a question in here. It wasn't clear initially if we're building images or downloading images. And how do we specify something other than Docker Hub? That's a great question. And let me take you over to the registry and I'll show you where you can find that information. In this case, we are downloading images instead of building them just because of time. Normally you can do docker.image instead of docker.remoteimage. Here's our API docs for the Docker provider. If you wanted to build the image, you'd be using the image resource right here. Go away, Pulumipus. In this case, we're using remote image, so pulling down an image. And then the changing the name here, I believe it's under name. I think you actually, that's where you give it like an EC2 or not EC2, ECR. Like if you gave it an ECR link or the Google Container Registry or Artifact Registry, you'd give that here. Remind me at the end, and I will pull up another repo that has that information to show you what it looks like. Okay? Just make sure I remember and I don't forget about it. But if you ever want to take a look at the API for any of our providers, head on over to registry.pulumi.com and you'll be able to find all that there. Okay, so we have our activity. If you are running this on like a CI/CD system or you don't have access to the terminal, you can see the same thing we just took a look at, including the diff. So you're always able to get that information here as well. And you can star this and it'll show up in your favorites, which makes life a lot easier. Okay, now that we have that running, we now can kind of talk a little bit about those inputs and outputs real quick. So the input is this name. And if I did a Pulumi.export and asked for information, that's how I can get the output to dump out to my terminal, which we will do possibly as we get a little further along. But the output would be the name of this Docker image. So we'll see. We're going to use that in just a little bit. Now that we've provisioned this very first piece, let's move on and kind of add some more pieces. We need our Mongo image and a front-end client. So we have these. I'm just going to real quick make this a little more my style of Python, where it moves it over so that we can see it on the screen. So now we have 3 different resources, and you can do a quick comparison against my code. It should look basically the same. I might actually change this to front-end image name, which is really fun to be able to just use that. We'll just leave that as Docker. So that should be fine. Now, we could run Pulumi up here. And in fact, I think we will. You don't always have to run Pulumi up, though, after every time you build something. You can write all of the code all at once and then run Pulumi up. It's just a little bit easier here so that you all can see a little bit of how everything is made and put together. You'll notice, though, in this case, that we're not changing the backend image. So there's no need to update it. That's another great thing about infrastructure as code. It's able to detect what's going on and build it from there. So there we are. We have our images. Now, if you're following along, we're going to move on to lab 3 and kind of go through it all. So now we learn a little bit about adding configuration values. So right up here at the very top, we underneath stack creation, we're going to add this little snippet that says, hey, get me the Pulumi config object. The config object is the information that we pass to Pulumi to let it actually understand some of our basic configuration values per stack. So this is where that dev stack and a staging stack and a prod stack can be of use. In this case, we want those 2 ports opened that we mentioned earlier. Sorry, 3 ports opened that we mentioned earlier. They're going to be the same from stack to stack, but we don't really feel like hard coding them in. But as we'll see in just a little bit, when we move on from a local, we'll have a local stack. Well, we want to tell it that the local stack is going to be using a dev environment, a couple of other things. So it's just a little bit easier to have this kind of system in place to run. Now, it should match the code. And when we try to run Pulumi up, something really interesting is going to happen. Watch what happens when we try to run Pulumi up. It's going to throw an error. So in this case, it's telling us, hey, where's your configuration variables? Where's the values that go in here? If you were to go back and explore your stack here a little bit, maybe it will decide to load for me. Maybe it won't. It doesn't. That's okay. You should actually get a .dev, or actually, no, I think I have to run the command first. Anyway, we have to tell Pulumi what these configuration values are. So in this case, we want to set the front-end port, the back-end port, and the Mongo port, just like we saw in our Docker files. So we have Pulumi config set front-end port to 3001, the back-end port to 3000, and the Mongo port to 27017. There is a Pulumi config set all that you can run. I'm currently running each one sequentially. It's up to you how you do that. So we let those run. And now if you take a look inside your project, you're going to see this pulumi.dev.yaml file suddenly appear. And this has all your configuration values. Anything that you tell Pulumi through the CLI. Now, I'm going to tell you that, can you modify things here? Yes. So I could add all these variables in here myself, but there's no validation on this until you run the Pulumi CLI. So it's actually much better to define all of these configuration values from the CLI itself instead of entering it all into your own stack file, because Pulumi won't read that right away. So I don't recommend doing it, like going in here and saying like, oh, I want to change this to 27018. I don't recommend doing that. You could. But I generally find that leaving this file alone on its own is probably better. So actually, I'm going to leave this file without saving. So now when we run, we'll just run Pulumi preview in this case, just for the sake of time. When we run Pulumi preview, you'll actually see that it's perfectly happy understanding that now. No more errors. All right. Let's add the rest of our resources that we need. We need a network because always when you're running Docker, you need a network. So we have our Docker network. And then we're going to define some new container resources. So we have our backend container. And you'll notice it's giving me some errors. That's because we have to define these values here soon. And all of that. We'll get a chance to define those in a minute. And we'll get those environment variables here. Let's go back up here and add those. Not like that. I have to actually put the code in like this. So we have our Mongo host, our database, node environment, and our protocol. Now, when we actually run these and we set these up, this is where the stack actually makes sense. Because in this case, we have a protocol of HTTP because we're just running it on our local host. But if you were running this in a production environment, you would actually want HTTPS. So this is why these configuration values are valuable. Same thing with that node environment using development instead of production. So I'm just going to save those real quick. And it's going to be a lot happier. And where else is it complaining at me? Oh, the Mongo container. This is where we can also add in some various things that are really helpful. We can start talking about the output from other resources here. So in this case, we're aliasing the Mongo, but this network name is an output from creating the network resource. So I'm able to actually just call that output as a variable to pass in as an input to the next resource in my list. Same thing here, where I'm telling it that the backend container needs to depend on the Mongo container coming up first. So we're giving it a little bit of an order of operations in creation here. However, something to know about Pulumi is that these resources are created not necessarily in a specific order. Pulumi is a declarative system, and it ensures that, hey, I like to call it's the ideal setup of it's asking for this is the ideal that I want. Go make this happen, Pulumi. Go deploy things so that I end up with these things set up in this way. You're not actually giving it the commands that says, okay, first build this image. Now push it here. Now set up this container this specific way. Da, 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 da. Instead, you're just defining it and telling Pulumi to create that for you. So, but anyway, so we had the Mongo container, the backend container. Let's grab the front end container, which is the very last piece here. And we'll add that in here. And again, I'm just going to do a little bit of Python cleanup. You don't have to do this. I'm doing it so that we can read it next to the terminal. So we have all of our images, all of our containers, all of our stuff together. And we're just going to do a quick double check. We have all of our configured values here. So that's good. It does look a lot like Docker Compose, doesn't it? I don't have any of the typical like language stuff you could do in here. But if I wanted to create like 4 different versions of that front end container, I can just wrap it in an if statement. I can wrap it in a for loop. I can do whatever I want. So that's the one thing that's different from like your standard YAML compose or even Terraform. We can just have these lovely loops and anything like it. Oh no. Okay, well, this is good to know that the Mongo database image is only available for ARM. We'll see if anybody gets stuck on that. So, all right. So we have all of our different bits and pieces. Let's stand this up because this does take a minute. And we are going to run Pulumi up, and then I will answer more questions from the chat. It should give me, again, 4 more things to create. We're going to hit yes here and let it run. Okay, so more questions. What haven't I gotten a chance to answer? Pardon me. So I'll grab you the docs for poetry in a minute about virtual environments, unless Scott can get to those first in the Q&A tab. Woo! Oh, that was fast. Okay. It actually stood it up a lot faster than I expected. But you can see here we have all of our images. And again, the containers are running. The backend container needs to stand up again. Let's make sure that that's running. I think it got stuck. Normally it runs great. But for some reason, that one just doesn't want to run. Let's see. And of course, the demo gods love me. I've always done this. Now it's running properly. There we go. So you can see everything is running with the proper ports mapped and everything like that. Now we're going to find out if my tea shop is going to work. Sometimes this does take a minute to load. So we're going to see if that loads here in just a second, but the containers themselves are all running. Anybody have any other questions in the chat? There it goes. Now it's loading. Might take a minute to stand up. So let me see. If you do have a question, Ethan, you can just drop it in the chat. You don't have to raise your hand. I'm not sure if that was an accidental hand raise, because I know that's pretty easy to do on this system. But let me look up those poetry documentation. Let's see. Best practices Pulumi for migration from one platform to another. That's a great question. Here in the learn.pulumi.com section, we have a whole bit of information about importing. You can learn a little bit more about importing there. Really, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. It really depends on how many resources you're dealing with and all that. So this thing should be loading soon. What happened if a Docker resource disappeared and at the same moment the same resource in Pulumi still exists? How do you resolve that inconsistency? No, that's a great question. So there's a couple different ways to do it. The first thing I always opt to is a command called Pulumi refresh. What that does is it refreshes the state, my state that's on the Pulumi system, refreshes that against my providers and what's currently there. Yay! Here's our tea shop. It did load. Awesome. So that's probably the first thing I do. And then if I'm still having issues, there's a troubleshooting page in the Pulumi docs that has some step-by-step directions on removing an item from state and then just refreshing that information. So that's really the best practice way of doing it. I can't say much about any future updates that might be happening to that, but I do think that some people are looking at some better quality of life on that. And then name of my terminal custom theme. Now that's so are you asking for PyCharm or are you asking for this terminal? Because this one is Peppermint with a background that we created just for fun with the old Pulumipus logo and a couple of other things. And then this one here is actually the GitHub Lite from Material Light. I won't nerd out too much about terminal colors, but it's Starship RS. So if you're curious. Okay, so we have our Boba Tea Shop app. Here it is. It is working and it is up. Let's just real quick in the last couple minutes, we're going to run a command to just update everything. Yes, you can export the state to JSON, change the JSON, import it again. I personally find that it's a lot of work that you can actually try to pull off from the terminal itself instead of manipulating the JSON. So I try to avoid manipulating the JSON just because it's kind of messy. But that being said, there's always different ways to do it. So that troubleshooting link that Scott dropped there in the chat is probably your best bet. Let's real quick just update our Tea Shop. So there is a curl command in the workshop repo in lab 3. All it's doing is saying, hey, go post this to this API that's part of the backend with some data. We're going to have a new milk tea called My New Milk Tea. We're going to watch and see. We get a status of okay. So that means it's been updated. And if we flip back over here and just refresh this page, there it is. My New Milk Tea. So that is the Boba Tea Shop, and that is a little bit about resources. There's one last thing to do here as we take a look at all of our resources here, and that is to actually tear down everything. The nice thing about Pulumi is by having everything in state actually up in the Pulumi SaaS, you can destroy a stack or tear it down so that you don't incur any charges like if you're on an actual cloud provider. In this case, I'm just going to just pull it down out of Docker because I don't really feel like leaving it up. I really would only do this if this is a sandbox environment or you're definitely not going to need it, just because otherwise, it's not always the best idea to tear down everything on yourself when you're running production stuff, just in case you didn't know that. Tearing down production kind of annoys people. Just a slight note. But we're going to run a preview, destroy 8 things to delete, and it's just going to run through and clean me up a little bit so I don't have any more dangling images or containers. But it keeps track of everything that's currently running, so I'm able to understand. Last thing to note about that. Here I am, my first app.dev. So the dev stack is still there. All my history, all the configuration values that we put in, it doesn't go away. It just pulls down the resources so there's nothing left. But the configuration values and the history is still there so that it's easy to stand it back up. In my case, I don't really need any of it. And you'll see that information here in the CLI. It'll tell you the resources in the stack have been deleted, but the history and configuration are still maintained. If you want to remove that stack completely, run Pulumi stack remove with the dev thing. So we're going to just remove that real quick because I don't need it. Now, if you were not in this repository where you can find that pulumi.yaml, you would be giving a fully qualified stack name. Now I'm going to put that in quotes, fully qualified stack name, which would be the organization you're in, which for most of us is just our personal org, / the project name. So this would be my-first-app /dev, which would be found right here at the top of the stack information itself, if you didn't know where to find it. So in this case, though, since there's already plumi.yaml in this directory, I'm just going to remove the stack. And it just asks me, hey, can you please just type the name in there? I say, yeah, it's just dev. And we're going to remove it. And it's going to disappear from my application or from my dashboard. There it is. No project. There's nothing like this here. All right. So yes, that was Pulumi destroy. And the public Docker image that has the latest Pulumi CLI already installed. Ooh, that's a good question. I think so. I don't know off the top of my head. But where is the poetry one? I still owe someone a question about the docs for using poetry to manage the virtual environment. I also do remember everybody asked me to do this with them. Let me find my poetry one. Let's see. I want a recent one. Was it this one? We're about to find out if I did poetry on this. You all aren't going to see this yet. Let me double check that I did use poetry here in my Pulumi files. No, I didn't. Okay. Well, I'm looking for one of them that I remember doing this in so I could show you what it looks like without me building it for you. But the short version, if you want to change this to poetry, you remove this. So let's try it. Let's find out if I still remember what I'm doing here. We're gonna do this live all together. How about that? Um, let's clear this. So this, and then we remove VM. Delete. Yep, I want to delete the directory so we don't have VM anymore. And I want to do poetry in it. Yep. All right, y'all ready to see me try to do this live? Because this will be the fun part. Pulumi 0, okay. And then don't care about the version. Pulumi Docker. Let's see. I'm going to do it and skip. Yeah, but there's nothing I'm going to add. Yes, I'm confirming the generation. Okay, so we should have poetry in here. There's my poetry project. Yeah, I'm excited to see how this works too, because I haven't done this in a very long time. But we're going to find out. I do believe there is a runtime option while I'm thinking about this. Virtual environment. I think we just have to do poetry run. So poetry run, and then it'll be Pulumi up. I think. We're about to find out. Yes, create a new stack. We're just going to call it dev. Going to give me an error. Dev. Oh, okay. And then it's poetry shell. Remembering right here. And think. No. Okay. I forget how this works. I know I'm doing this the horrible way. I apologize to everybody using poetry. My brain is currently a little bit mush, but now we should have everything. Now, if we run, let me deactivate. And so poetry run Pulumi up. It should let me do. And it's giving me that missing configuration because remember, we tore down the stack and we don't have configuration. So that's the really quick way to do this. It's not the smartest way, but it's the quick way. There is a, in this section, there's information. Let me drop this into the chat. This reference doc is a reference on the Pulumi YAML file, this one that I went and modified over here. And I believe there's the, I could do virtual env and then put this in as the option to put in poetry instead of venv. And it should run the poetry system, I think is how that worked. It's been a long time. So I hope this kind of gives you a bit of a quick sense of doing it. Yes, it does work. I promise it does. I just couldn't remember how to get the dependencies to run in the shell. My Pulumi, my poetry project I screwed it up last week and I haven't gotten a chance to fix it yet. My local install. So it's giving me a little bit of issues, but I hope that gives you a sense of it. We are at the end of time. Again, please do head over to the workshops repo. The workshops repo, the workshops channel on Slack to ask me more questions. I will be kind of poking my head in there just a little bit over the next week or so, just to see if there's any questions, but there's also a lot of people who are happy to answer that. I'm really happy you all, let me stop screen sharing here. I'm really happy you all stopped through to learn a little bit about Pulumi. I hope you learned something really cool today. And we'll see you next time. Uh, the Pulumi up command ever timeout. It can. I haven't really seen it in a very long time. I think there is a configurable timeout. Ask that question in the workshops channel on Slack, and we'll make sure you get that answer. So, on that note, I hope you all have a lovely time. Have a great day, folks.